1959, the Dalai Lama, the religious and political leader of Tibet at the time, fled from Tibet and into Dharamsala, India. Along with him came thousands of Tibetans, and a community in exile in northern India was established. Dharamsala is home to the largest community of Tibetans outside of Tibet and is where I am currently located to learn about and study Tibet. Since Tibet is currently occupied by China, it would be difficult to grasp the reality of this two-sided conflict while living inside Tibet, as the Chinese government enforces strict censorship laws on Tibetans and forms of media within the country. This hinders the Tibetan people's ability to freely express their side of the story. Therefore, it is important to note that I am presenting this information from a Tibetan community in exile located in Dharamsala, India, not in Tibet. Tibet is the location of Earth's third pole, as it contains the largest freshwater glaciers outside of the North and South Poles. The glaciers of the Tibetan Plateau are the source of some of Asia's greatest and most important rivers, including the Yellow, Indus, and Brahmaputra rivers. These rivers are depended upon by over 40% of the world's population, so the Tibetan Plateau plays a crucial role in supplying water to people in cities all over Asia. Additionally, Tibet is known as the roof of the world due to its massive surface area of 2.5 million square kilometers and average elevation of 4,000 meters above sea level. These characteristics make the Tibetan Plateau both the largest and highest plateau in the world. Tibet's unique mountainous landscape is treasured by Tibetans and greatly valued by surrounding countries as well. Since almost 97% of Tibetans practice Buddhism, Buddhism plays a significant role in shaping the Tibetan culture. The religion of Buddhism emphasizes compassion towards all sentient beings, and Buddhism also focuses on the idea of karma. Buddhists believe that if a person treats others well and is compassionate throughout their life, then they will be reincarnated to have a great life the next time that they are reborn. Therefore, Tibetan culture is strongly based around nonviolence as well as kindness. Buddhist traditions influence all aspects of Tibetan lifestyle and play a role in important events such as weddings, deaths, births, and graduations. Monks are highly respected in Tibetan society, especially since the path to becoming a monk is very academically rigorous, as it involves decades of studying and memorizing Buddhist texts. Most households and shops in the Tibetan community have pictures of the 14th Dalai Lama, the current Buddhist religious leader, that is adorned with offerings, and sometimes there is even an entire room dedicated to meditation and the worshipping of Buddha. Additionally, around Tibetan settlements like MacLeod Ganj, Tibetan prayer flags and prayer wheels are everywhere as symbols of the Buddhist religion. Tibetan culture is a patchwork of a variety of different Asian cultures and contains cultural aspects from neighboring Nepal, India, and China. In the 8th century, scholars and missionaries, mainly from India and Nepal, came to Tibet to spread ideas of Buddhism and to translate Buddhist texts. Over time, the concepts of Buddhism brought from India and Nepal were altered and adjusted to form Tibetan Buddhism, which still remains an influential aspect of the culture in Tibet today. Throughout history, China has also had a significant influence on Tibetan culture. The methods of producing butter, cheese, and Tibet's national beverage, butter tea, were adopted from skills that were introduced by the Chinese. Additionally, arts such as pottery were brought to Tibet from China, and many traditional cultural structures in Tibet contain Chinese influence. Even though Tibetan culture contains elements of a variety of neighboring civilizations, the culture in Tibet has developed to be a distinct society due to its unique combination of external inspirations. Currently, one of the most pressing questions concerning Tibet's legal status is Tibet a country? While the Chinese government insists that Tibet is and has been a fundamental part of China for centuries, Tibetans claim that Tibet is an independent state but under illegal occupation by the People's Republic of China. When Chinese troops first invaded Lhasa, Tibet's capital city, claiming that Tibet needed to be liberated and modernized by a powerful nation such as China, they held such dominance over the small Tibetan army that Tibet had no choice but to surrender to the Chinese government. Therefore, from a legal standpoint, since the Tibetan government was pressured into signing these agreements under force, Tibet remains an independent state under unlawful occupation. While Tibetans refer to Tibet as a region that encompasses the entire Tibetan plateau, Chinese maps depict Tibet as an area called the Tibet Autonomous Region that is about half the size of the Tibetan plateau. On Chinese political maps, the remainder of the Tibetan plateau is carved up and incorporated into China to form modern Chinese provinces. Even though the area is called Tibet Autonomous Region, Tibet is anything but autonomous. China rules over Tibet through the use of harsh policies and censorship, and the Chinese government maintains authority over Tibet by threatening Tibetans with violence. Recent peaceful protests in Tibet have been violently suppressed by the Chinese police, and the protesters are often imprisoned, tortured, or even killed. Tibetans are often detained and brutally abused as political prisoners for expressing simple desires for freedom, such as waving the Tibetan flag, playing the Tibetan national anthem, or possessing a photograph of the Dalai Lama. China strictly controls the spread of information about the situation inside and outside of Tibet. The Chinese government strictly monitors social media, email, and telephone communications within the region. And foreign news reporters and human rights agencies are rarely allowed to enter Tibet, despite China's claim that Tibetans are happy and prosperous under Chinese rule. Because of the Tibetans' lack of basic human freedoms, Tibet is currently considered one of the worst countries worldwide in terms of human rights violations. After His Holiness the Dalai Lama's safety was threatened in Tibet, he was forced to flee by foot over the Himalayan mountains and into northern India in 1959. Along with the Tibetan leader came about 80,000 other Tibetans who are seeking asylum outside of Tibet, and in the years since, thousands more Tibetans have continued to seek refuge in nearby nations. Tibetans who are fleeing from Chinese-occupied Tibet escape and travel only during the night in an effort to avoid being caught by the Chinese police and border security. The trek from Tibet into India is not a simple one, as it involves crossing the rugged terrain and spending up to a month in the extreme climate conditions of the Himalayan mountains. Because of how dangerous this journey is, many Tibetans have lost their lives from illness, lack of food and warmth, or harsh weather circumstances that they encountered while on the path to freedom. The Tibet Autonomous Region is currently governed by an exiled government, the CTA, or the Central Tibetan Administration. Since this is a government in exile, the headquarters are located in Dharamsala, India, rather than in Tibet. CTA was originally established by the 14th Dalai Lama in 1959 after he escaped from Tibet. But when the Dalai Lama gave up his role as its political leader in 2011, an elected president became the leader of the Tibetan government in exile. With both the Dalai Lama and CTA headquarters being located in Dharamsala, a strong Tibetan community has been established in this region of India. Currently, thousands of Tibetan exiles have settled in Dharamsala, and they have brought with them traditional aspects of Tibetan culture, which has helped the previously small Indian community to flourish. Tibetan schools, Buddhist monasteries, and Buddhist temples have all been set up as a result of the growing Tibetan population in Dharamsala. Additionally, Tibetan music, crafts, and cuisine have also become a fundamental aspect of the Dharamsala culture. Since China's occupation of Tibet, the Chinese government has enforced policies and reforms within Tibet which have resulted in the sinicization of traditional Tibetan culture. Many aspects of the Tibetan culture have been replaced by Chinese influences. For example, in recent years, Chinese has become the central language of education and business within Tibet rather than the Tibetan language. Therefore, the Tibetan language is being marginalized. Also, actions by the Chinese government have threatened the preservation of Tibetan Buddhism, one of the most distinct aspects of Tibetan culture. Under Chinese rule, 6,000 Buddhist temples, monasteries, and nunneries in Tibet have been destroyed, along with thousands of ancient Buddhist scriptures and texts. The few Buddhist institutes that currently remain in Tibet have been converted into tourist attractions. Additionally, Lhasa, the capital city of Tibet, is being transformed and remodeled to resemble a modern Chinese city. Many of the old traditional structures in Tibet have been knocked down and replaced by shopping malls, hotels, and restaurants, which are both damaging to the Tibetan economy and threatening to classical Tibetan architecture. As the Chinese population continues to transfer into Tibet, the small Tibetan population of 3.1 million is being rapidly diluted. This results in Tibetans becoming a minority within their own country. Climate change is currently one of the most urgent threats to the Tibetan Plateau, its wildlife, and its inhabitants. Due to elevation and the intensity of the sun in Tibet, the rate of temperature increase on the Tibetan Plateau is 3 times more than the average global increase. Warming temperatures have resulted in retreating glaciers in the Tibetan Plateau, and if the current rate of retreat continues, 2/3 of Tibetan glaciers will be gone by 2050. The melting of these glaciers has triggered mudslides and flooding, which are detrimental to the ecosystem as well as the nomadic agriculture in the area. Warming temperatures have also caused extensive degradation of permafrost, which is frozen soil depended upon by much of the life on the Tibetan Plateau. If the permafrost melts, 70% of Tibet could become desert. Additionally, since the invasion of Tibet, Chinese industries have further threatened the fragile Tibetan environment through mining, damming, and deforestation projects on the Tibetan Plateau. So the Tibetan Plateau is in imminent endangerment due to climate change and land exploitation. And the decline of the plateau poses threats to not only Tibet, but surrounding Asian regions as well. Since the beginning of the Chinese occupation of Tibet, Tibetans have never stopped resisting the oppression placed upon them by the Chinese government, and have continued to fight for the freedom of their country. Protests by Tibetans, both in and out of the autonomous region, are guided by Buddhist values and nonviolent principles. However, these peaceful protests are often brutally oppressed by the Chinese police, and an extreme form of protest which has occurred in the Tibetan population is self-immolation, or the act of purposely lighting oneself on fire. More than 150 Tibetans have committed self-immolation as a way to express their passion for saving Tibet and to illustrate their dissatisfaction with the Chinese government. Activism has also occurred in forms other than protest. Tibetans are shedding light upon the crisis in their country by discussing the issue in the form of stories, poetry, and music. Additionally, organizations have been established to raise a worldwide awareness for Tibetan issues within Tibetan communities in exile, such as Students for Free Tibet and the Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy. The situation in Tibet has triggered activism amongst both Tibetans and non-Tibetans alike to continue to fight and bring awareness to Tibetan issues with the aim of preserving Tibet's unique culture and environment, as well as protecting the Tibetan people.